The air was heavy. It smelled of metal, disinfectant, and an almost unbearable musk that clung to the inside of the cabin. The low hum of the airplane's engines vibrated beneath the seats, a constant reminder of where he was headed. The atmosphere felt thick, each breath harder to take, as if the air itself was mourning. Corporal John Carpenter stood rigid beside the open seat where the flag-draped casket sat, alone and surrounded by the empty chairs, as if they too were too afraid to come too close. His eyes, tired from the journey, locked onto the dark wood of the casket. He didn't see the flag. He didn't see the gold stars that represented the sacrifice. He only saw the body within, the soul that would never return to the family it left behind. His own soul felt similarly buried, abandoned, and forgotten. A cold sweat trickled down the side of his face, and he wiped it away with the back of his gloved hand, noticing the shaky tremble. He didn't allow himself to feel this. Not here. Not now. The flight attendant approached him, her heels clicking sharply against the cold floor. She was young, her face marked with a sadness she couldn't hide, but she wore it like a mask, hoping the others wouldn't notice. Her eyes lingered on the casket, before quickly darting away as if looking at it too long would bring bad luck. The soldiers in the back of the plane had turned into a distant murmur of voices. Some were laughing, others talking in low voices, but John could feel the weight of their glances on him. "Sir, we'll be landing soon," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she were afraid of disturbing the moment. John gave a nod, not trusting his voice to speak. He had no words left. His chest felt tight, constricted, like a rope had been tied around it and was slowly pulling, inch by inch. He had seen death before. But never like this. Never so final. The air was colder now, the artificial heat of the cabin working against the weight in his chest. His uniform felt too tight, too confining. The weight of the metal he still wore on his left breast felt like a cruel joke, mocking him for a service he hadn't even wanted. He hadn't volunteered for this. He hadn't chosen this life. But somewhere along the way, he had been made to believe this was the only way to survive. John thought back to the beginning, before he had been assigned to escort the fallen soldier's body back to his family. It wasn't just any soldier, it was one who had betrayed him. The same soldier who, a year ago, had been his best friend. The same soldier who had stabbed him in the back in the worst possible way, by stealing everything he had worked so hard for. His thoughts began to spiral into the darkness. His stomach twisted, his hands gripped the side of the seat tighter. Rejection. Betrayal. Humiliation. He could still see the look on his fiancée's face when she had told him she was leaving him for his best friend. How her voice cracked, her words cutting into him with precision. She had left him for a man who had once called him brother, and John had never seen it coming. When John had returned from his deployment, he had found their home empty. The door, once warm and inviting, had been left wide open, as if to mock him. She had taken everything, his heart, his love, and his trust. She had even taken his dreams. That was when he had realized he didn't have anything left. But it didn't stop there. It had been months since the pain of betrayal had settled in, but the scars were still raw. John had soldiered on, literally. He buried himself in his work, in his duty. He drowned himself in the war, in the orders, in the rigid life he had created to numb the emptiness. And then, just as the fog of his pain was beginning to lift, it had happened again. His so-called best friend, the one he had shared everything with, had died on the battlefield. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had taken everything from him, the man who had ruined his life, was now the one whose body he had to escort. It was a cruel twist of fate. But John had been chosen for this mission, and no one else. He had no choice but to honor it, to carry the weight of the past and the burden of the man who had crushed his spirit. And yet, as the miles passed beneath the plane, as he sat in the eerie silence of the cabin, a strange realization began to rise inside him. He had every right to hate this man, to hate the world. He had every right to hold on to his anger, to resent the way he had been cast aside, abandoned, humiliated. But in that moment, he understood something else. Holding on to that anger would only kill him from the inside out. It wasn't justice. It wasn't vengeance. It was just more pain. For the first time, John considered the idea of forgiving. Not for his best friend. Not for the people who had hurt him. But for himself. For his own survival. As the flight continued, John closed his eyes, leaning against the cold window. He let the sounds of the engine wash over him, the faint hum lulling him into a dreamless state. The plane began its descent, the engines roaring louder as they pierced the thick silence. John shifted his weight, every muscle in his body feeling the tension of the journey. The casket remained in its place, a silent companion to his thoughts. The soldiers at the back, their voices fading into the background, were unaware of what was weighing heavily on his mind. He didn't know why he was chosen for this task, nor did he want to know. But deep down, there was a strange sense of duty gnawing at him, something he could not explain. It wasn't just the betrayal that haunted him, or the rejection, or the humiliation. It was something more primal. Something that ran deeper than he ever imagined. He had been abandoned by the people he loved, abandoned by the country he served, but now he was forced to carry the final remains of the man who had destroyed him. And yet, there was no comfort in the mission. No sense of honor. No glory. Just a soul weighed down by years of unresolved anger and despair. As the plane hit the ground, the smoothness of the landing did little to ease his growing anxiety. The airstrip stretched out before him, stretching endlessly into the unknown. But as the aircraft came to a stop, John was jolted back into the present by the sound of the cockpit door sliding open. His heart skipped a beat. Two men, both in civilian clothing, emerged from the doorway. Their eyes immediately locked onto John, their expressions stern and unreadable. One of them, a tall man with broad shoulders, walked directly toward him, a sense of purpose in his stride. John stood up straight, his jaw tightening as he mentally prepared himself. "You're not authorized to bring that casket off the plane," the man said, his voice low but commanding. His eyes flickered down to the flag draped over the wooden coffin, then back to John. John didn't respond. He simply stood there, his posture stiff, eyes narrowed. The tall man tried again, his voice sharper now. "You don't have permission to escort the remains of a soldier under these conditions. You need to hand it over." For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. It was as if time had stopped entirely, leaving only the two of them standing in this frozen silence. The man's eyes burned with an intensity that sent a shiver down John's spine. He could feel the sweat on his palms, the raw tension that had started to bubble beneath his skin. He knew what this was. It was more than just an order. It was a challenge. A challenge he couldn't ignore. Not when every moment of his life had been shaped by challenges, by being the other, by being the black man who had always had to prove he was enough. The weight of systemic rejection had never been lost on John, and this moment, this confrontation, felt all too familiar. "Who are you to tell me what I can or can't do?" John said, his voice so cold, it sent a ripple of surprise through the man's features. The man's posture shifted, his face momentarily betraying a flicker of hesitation. But he quickly masked it with an air of authority. "Step aside, soldier," he commanded. "You're not taking that body with you." John's fingers twitched, as if responding to some invisible pull from the very core of his being. The injustice of it all crashed down on him like a tidal wave. He had already been humiliated by the system. He had already been betrayed by the one person he trusted. He had already been abandoned when his fiancée walked out of his life. Now, someone wanted to take away the last shred of dignity he had left, the last vestige of honor he could still hold on to. His skin, dark and strong, had always set him apart. In a world where he was constantly fighting to be seen as more than just a label, he wasn't just a soldier. He wasn't just a man. He was this, a reminder of the history that had always cast shadows on his every move, on every decision. John had felt the sting of discrimination from the first day he enlisted, but he had always put up a mask of resilience, hiding the hurt behind a uniform. But in this moment, in the eyes of the man standing before him, he saw it again, the subtle glance, the hidden prejudice. A surge of anger rose within him, raw and visceral. The urge to shout, to lash out, almost overtook him. But he had learned to control his emotions, to bury them deep down where they couldn't harm him. He had no choice now but to stay calm. "No," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. The words seemed to echo in the cold air of the cabin. The man stepped forward, his hand raising as if to grab John's arm, but John's eyes locked onto his with the intensity of a predator. A dangerous, calculating calm overtook him. "I said no." The man faltered, his eyes narrowing. He hadn't expected resistance, especially not from someone like John. He clearly thought the soldier would break under pressure. He was wrong. John had been broken before, but he had rebuilt himself into someone far stronger. He had learned to weather storms, to face whatever came his way with unflinching resolve. "What do you think you're going to do, huh?" The man scoffed, sneering as he tried to intimidate John. "You're a nobody. You're just a pawn. Step aside before I have to handle this the hard way." John's chest tightened, but the cold anger inside him only burned hotter. His life had already been shattered by betrayal and rejection, but he wasn't going to let this man break him too. Not today. Not here. Not when the last remnants of his dignity were on the line. The room felt suffocating now, the tension so thick it was almost unbearable. For a split second, John thought of stepping aside. He thought about surrendering, giving into the weight of all the hurt and the pain. But then he remembered. He remembered the man in the casket. He remembered the betrayal. And he remembered who he was. He was more than a pawn. With an almost imperceptible movement, John stood taller, his shoulders square, and met the man's gaze head-on. "I said no," he repeated, the conviction in his voice stronger than ever. "You're not stopping me." The man hesitated, his hand lowering. He didn't expect this kind of defiance. He had been ready for a fight, but not this kind of fight. Not a fight of willpower. He took a step back, clearly reconsidering. John had won this round. But John knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The man took a long, hard look at John, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence between them, the tension still thick, pressing on both their chests. The hum of the plane's engines seemed distant now, as if it were part of another world. John, with his dark skin, his towering presence, and the weight of the moment pressing down on him, didn't break his gaze. He couldn't. Not now. The other man's face was unreadable. He shifted on his feet, clearly weighing his options, and for a fleeting moment, John thought he saw doubt flicker behind his cold eyes. But it quickly vanished, replaced by the stubborn arrogance of someone used to getting their way. He let out a frustrated breath. "You've made a mistake, soldier," he muttered, his voice laced with irritation. "This is bigger than you. You're not getting that casket off this plane." John's hands tightened into fists at his sides. The arrogance in the man's voice reminded him of everything he had fought against in his life, the systems that had failed him, the people who had underestimated him, the moments when his skin, his identity, had always been the deciding factor in how others saw him. This man, with his commanding tone, didn't understand the battle John had been waging his whole life. But he was about to learn. "I've had enough of being told what I can and can't do." John's voice was low, but there was a sharpness to it now, the calm before the storm. "You don't get to decide for me anymore." The man hesitated, his eyes scanning John as if trying to read him, trying to find a crack in his resolve. But there was none. He couldn't break him. John had been through too much. He had already been through the worst, and this was just another battle. "Fine," the man spat, his hand balling into a fist. "But you'll regret this." He turned his back and started to walk toward the cabin door, but John wasn't finished. "I don't regret what I've done," John said, his voice steady. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to the man or to himself. It didn't matter. His words hung in the air, raw and unflinching. The door opened, and the man was gone, leaving John standing there with nothing but the casket and his thoughts. He glanced down at the wooden box, the red, white, and blue flag draped carefully over it. It was a symbol of a life given, of service that had ended in tragedy. He had no idea who the soldier inside was, no knowledge of the life he had lived. But he knew the pain that had brought him here, the betrayal, the heartache. It was all the same. A man, just like him, caught in the grind of the world, trying to make something of himself only to be torn down by forces beyond his control. John's throat tightened, and he exhaled slowly. He had been so angry, so consumed by hate for the man who had ruined his life. The bitterness had almost consumed him. But standing there, alone with the casket, John felt something shift inside him. Maybe it was the quiet of the plane, or maybe it was just the weight of the years he had carried all on his own, but something had clicked. He wasn't going to let hatred define him anymore. He wasn't going to let it destroy him. As the man left the cabin, John knew his next move. He had to get the casket off the plane, had to fulfill the mission. But as he reached for the handle to move it, something else happened. A voice echoed in his head. "Forgive." The thought was strange at first, but it grew stronger. Forgive the man who had hurt him, forgive the world that had rejected him, forgive himself. It wasn't about forgetting, not about making peace with the wrongs that had been done. But it was about taking back his life. Taking back his control. He had been broken before, but he had built himself again. And now, with every breath, he felt stronger. Not because of his uniform, not because of his past, but because he had learned how to rise above the things that tried to pull him down. For a brief moment, he allowed himself a quiet smile, though it was fleeting. It was a bittersweet realization. He wasn't the man he had been before, the broken man consumed by resentment. And he wasn't going to be anyone's victim anymore. The doors of the plane slid open, and John stepped out, a weight lifting from his shoulders. The harsh, cold wind hit him, but he welcomed it. It reminded him that he was still here. He was still alive. At the foot of the stairs, the two men stood waiting. They hadn't expected John to follow through. He had expected them to try to stop him again, but instead, they stood in stunned silence, unsure how to proceed. They hadn't anticipated a black soldier, someone they probably viewed as expendable, taking a stand in front of them, taking ownership of his choices. It was at that moment that the full weight of what John had done settled on the men. "You've made your choice, soldier," the tall man said, his voice low. John didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had made his choice long ago. Without a word, John began to walk away, casket in tow. And as he did, he knew, no matter what happened next, no matter the road ahead, he had taken control of his destiny. And he would never be the same again. The cold air outside hit John like a slap, sharp and unforgiving. His boots crunched against the pavement as he stepped forward, casket in tow. The soldiers at the plane's entrance had not followed him, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the battle was over. But John knew better. There would be no peace, no simple ending. He wasn't fooling himself. This was only the beginning. His heart hammered in his chest as he made his way toward the terminal, the casket weighing heavily on his shoulders, but the weight was nothing compared to the burdens he'd carried all his life. The flag draped over the box fluttered slightly in the wind, and John's mind flashed back to the men who had given their lives for this very symbol, for this country, for ideals he had long stopped believing in. The soldiers who had fought, who had bled, who had never been given a chance to be anything more than pawns. But John wasn't a pawn. Not anymore. He could feel the stares of the others in the terminal. The whispers. The judgments. He had grown used to it over the years. People saw him as just another black man in uniform, just another soldier with no real voice, no real worth. But today, in this moment, he had the power. They didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know what he had endured. He wasn't going to let them silence him now. As he walked through the security checkpoint, the cold eyes of the officials followed him, but no one dared challenge him. John didn't look back. He just kept walking, every step a defiance of the systems that had sought to break him. He had walked through fire and come out stronger. And now, no matter what was thrown his way, he wasn't backing down. When he reached the final checkpoint before the loading area, 2 more officials appeared. They were younger, with the same air of authority the others had carried, but this time, there was something different. They didn't look at John with the same suspicion. They didn't try to stop him. Instead, one of them spoke. "You're sure you want to do this?" the young man asked, his voice soft but firm, like someone who had seen the world through weary eyes. John didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. His mind flashed back to his last day in the field, the day everything changed. The day he was betrayed by the one person he thought he could trust, the day the woman he loved left him behind, her words cutting deep into his soul. "You'll never be good enough. You'll never be enough for me, John. Not with your skin." Her words echoed in his mind, poisoning him, pushing him to places he never thought he'd go. It had taken him months to pull himself out of that darkness, to stop believing the lies. But now, standing here, he felt something different. He felt the power of being his own person, of claiming his worth. The same worth he had been denied for so long. "I'm sure," John said, finally meeting the young man's gaze. There was no hesitation in his voice now. The official nodded slowly. "We'll help you get it through, but you'll have to move fast. You're making quite a scene." John didn't care about the scene. He didn't care about anything except this one final act, the one that would define him, the one that would make everything he had endured worthwhile. He walked forward, his hand gripping the casket with a newfound purpose. But as they reached the loading dock, another figure appeared, stepping into his path. It was the tall man from the plane, the one who had tried to stop him before. His eyes were hard, his posture rigid, as if he had come to do what the others had failed to. "You think you can just walk away with this?" the man sneered. His voice was cold, dismissive. John stood tall, his body rigid with resolve. "Yes. I think I can." The man took a step closer, his hand twitching toward his belt. John could feel the tension mounting, the air growing thick with the weight of the moment. He wasn't afraid. He had fought battles far worse than this. But as the man drew closer, something in John shifted. It wasn't fear, but something deeper, something primal. He didn't need to fight this man. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. "I don't want to fight you," John said, his voice steady, yet his chest tightened with something he couldn't name. "I just want to do my job. Let me." The man paused, as if weighing John's words. He looked down at the casket, then back at John, his jaw clenched in frustration. But it was as though something clicked for him, something shifted. His expression hardened, but there was no malice in it anymore. Just resignation. "You're not what I thought you were," the man muttered, almost to himself. John didn't respond. He didn't need to. This wasn't about what the man thought of him. This was about what he thought of himself. The man stepped aside, his eyes lingering on John for a moment longer, before turning and walking back toward the terminal. With a final glance at the man, John stepped forward, the casket in tow, his heart thundering in his chest. This was it. The final test. The moment when everything he had been fighting for would either collapse or come together. And as the terminal doors opened, and John walked through, he realized something that stopped him in his tracks. The real test had never been the fight with the men who had tried to stop him. It wasn't the rejection, the humiliation, or the betrayal. The real test was letting go of the pain. Letting go of the anger that had consumed him for so long. And in that moment, John knew he had finally passed. He was free. The doors to the terminal closed behind John with a soft hiss, the hum of air conditioning almost too loud in the sudden stillness. His heartbeat was slow but steady as he moved through the crowd, but the weight of the casket never felt heavier. It was more than just the wood and the metal, it was the embodiment of everything he had been through, every person who had ever turned their back on him, every word that had cut deep, every expectation that had tried to define him. The lights above flickered slightly, the sterile, white glow casting long shadows across the floor. John's boots echoed against the polished tiles, each step reminding him of the power he had over his own destiny now. There were no more chains, no more expectations, no more silent battles fought in the dark. Still, the weight remained. As he walked, memories flashed in his mind, the past he could never truly outrun. His mother's quiet sacrifice, his father's stern advice, the countless soldiers who had gone before him. The ones who hadn't returned. The ones who had, but still carried the ghosts of their service in their eyes. The ones who would never see justice for their struggles, for their sacrifices. And then there was her. The woman who had loved him, or so he had thought. The woman who had left him, whose words were still lodged in his heart like shards of broken glass. "You'll never be good enough," she had said, her voice cold and dismissive. "Not with your skin." John shook the thought away, forcing his mind back to the present. He had to stay focused. He couldn't afford to let the ghosts of his past overtake him now, not when he was so close to something different, something more meaningful. He had already walked through the fire. He had already faced the demons that tried to define him. Now, he was choosing something else, peace. The terminal was quieter now, fewer people milling about. Most were too busy with their own lives, their own problems, to pay any attention to the soldier carrying a fallen comrade. And that's how it should be. He wasn't looking for praise, wasn't seeking validation from anyone. He had come here to honor the man in the casket, not himself. Yet, in doing so, he realized that he was honoring himself, too. Forgiveness had been the hardest thing for John to understand. How could he forgive those who had wronged him? How could he forgive a system that had treated him as less than, a world that had seen his worth through the lens of color rather than character? He had been taught that forgiveness was a weakness, a submission to the injustices done to him. But somewhere along the way, he had discovered that forgiveness wasn't about the other person. It wasn't about excusing the wrongs, or pretending they hadn't hurt him. It was about setting himself free. John had spent years living in the shadow of resentment. He had carried it with him like a badge, worn like armor against a world that had turned its back on him. But he had learned something in the dark, something he never thought possible. Letting go of that anger didn't make him weak. It made him strong. Stronger than any of his tormentors ever realized. As he approached the gate for his next flight, the officials standing by the check-in counter regarded him with the same cold, distant expressions. The air around them was thick with unspoken tension, but John didn't falter. His mind remained focused on the present, on the final task that lay ahead. One of the officials stepped forward. The man was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with a face that bore the marks of years of service and a lifetime of unspoken regrets. His eyes studied John for a long moment, and then his voice broke the silence. "We didn't expect you to make it this far," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. John didn't answer immediately. He knew what the man meant, even without saying it. No one had expected a black soldier, a man who had been treated like an afterthought his entire life, to carry the weight of someone else's legacy with such dignity. But John wasn't the same man he had been just a few days ago. The journey had changed him. "I'm not doing this for you," John replied, his voice steady, "and I'm not doing this for anyone else. I'm doing it for the soldier in that casket. For the ones who fought, and for the ones who never got a chance to." The older man nodded slowly, his eyes softening. For a brief moment, John saw something flicker in the man's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or a quiet acknowledgement of the strength it took to rise above the hatred and the pain. "Understood," the official said, stepping aside. "Proceed." John didn't hesitate. He walked past, the casket heavy in his hands, but his heart lighter than it had been in years. The plane's engine roared to life again as John climbed aboard, the same sounds he had heard so many times in his life. But today, it was different. Today, the noise felt like a call to something greater, something beyond the pain, beyond the wounds that had tried to define him. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, the seatbelt sign flashed on, but John didn't fasten his. His fingers lightly brushed the casket as he sat down. He didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid. As the plane ascended, John sat in silence, the steady hum of the engines a calming rhythm against the rising tension in his chest. The casket remained by his side, a solemn reminder of his mission, of the sacrifices made, and of the burdens carried, burdens both his own and those of others. His fingers lightly brushed the edge of the flag draped over the casket, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he was at peace. But just as the plane leveled out, an unexpected announcement crackled through the intercom, breaking the fragile calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have been informed of a situation. We kindly ask that the passenger in seat 15B please identify themselves and come to the front immediately." John's eyes snapped to the aisle. The voice on the intercom sounded official, urgent. His instincts flared, and his gaze instinctively moved towards seat 15B, where a man sat alone, his face partially obscured by the collar of his jacket. The man had been quiet the entire flight, but John had noticed him earlier, his posture rigid, his movements furtive. There was something about him that had seemed off. The announcement was followed by an odd, almost electric silence in the cabin. John's body tensed, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. His hands tightened around the edge of the casket. Something was wrong. He could feel it. As the flight attendants moved quickly through the aisle, the passenger in 15B remained still, his gaze flicking nervously toward the cockpit. He had been calm earlier, but now his eyes were wide, betraying a flicker of panic. The flight attendants, a mix of urgency and confusion in their movements, stopped in front of John. One of them, a woman with worried eyes, spoke quickly but quietly. "Sir, there's a problem with the man in 15B. He's been acting strange, and we're getting strange reports from the cockpit. We need you to come with us." John hesitated, heart racing. "What's going on?" The woman glanced over her shoulder, her eyes flicking to the man in 15B. "We think he's hiding something. We need you to help us, sir. It's serious." Without another word, John rose, the weight of the situation sinking in. He hadn't planned for this. This was not part of the mission. He was supposed to escort the fallen soldier, to honor him and carry out his duty, but now, his duty had taken an unexpected, dangerous turn. He walked down the aisle, every step heavy with purpose. As he neared seat 15B, the man sat motionless, his body tense. For a brief moment, John caught his eye. There was no defiance there, only fear, a deep, hollow fear that seemed to radiate off him in waves. I didn't mean to, the man stammered as John approached. I didn't know. I didn't think it would go this far. What are you talking about? John asked, his voice low but firm. The flight attendants were standing behind him now, their eyes shifting between John and the man. Something was terribly wrong. The man's eyes darted to the floor, his hands shaking. I was just supposed to watch the casket. Just keep an eye on it. I didn't know it was. It's not just a soldier's body. It's a cover. For something else. Something dangerous. John's blood ran cold. His gaze flicked back to the casket, a surge of realization coursing through him. A cover? He had been so focused on his mission, on the soldier, on the honor of it all, that he hadn't questioned what was truly in the casket. Now, in the pit of his stomach, he could feel the truth beginning to reveal itself. The man leaned closer, voice trembling. I thought it was just a soldier's body. I swear. But there's something in there, something that could destroy everything. I didn't know it was real. Before John could respond, a loud, unsettling noise erupted from the cockpit. A sudden turbulence shook the plane, sending the passengers into a flurry of unease. The plane jolted, and John's body tensed, his instincts going into overdrive. A flight attendant rushed down the aisle, her face pale with fear. Sir, we need to move fast. There's something in the cargo hold that's a threat. It's why the plane's been rattling like this. We need to secure everything before it's too late. John felt his chest tighten, his mind racing. The man in 15B had been telling the truth. The casket wasn't what it seemed. It was a decoy. And now, the situation was spiraling out of control. We have to do something, John said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. Where is it? The flight attendant led him toward the back of the plane, her steps quick, panicked. As they reached the rear cargo hold, John's heart pounded in his ears. He didn't know what he was going to find, but he knew it was more than just drugs or weapons. It was a part of a much larger scheme, one that had entangled him in its web. As they opened the cargo hold, the reality hit him with the force of a punch. The casket, which had been so heavy, now seemed too light. Too hollow. As he pried it open, he found what lay inside, something he had never expected. Inside, hidden beneath the false layers of a soldier's coffin, were files, stacks and stacks of documents, sealed and encrypted. They weren't weapons, drugs, or anything of the sort. They were classified government papers, ones that had the potential to expose a long-standing conspiracy involving high-ranking officials. The mission had never been about honor. It had never been about a fallen comrade. It had been about silencing the truth. The shock rippled through John like an electric current. The weight of betrayal was heavier than he could have imagined. The government, the very system he had fought for, had used him. It had used the soldier's death to cover up a scandal so vast it could shatter the foundations of everything he had believed in. John stood there, frozen, his hands trembling as he processed the magnitude of the situation. But there was no time for regret. He knew what had to be done. He looked back at the man in 15B, his face now stricken with realization. You never knew, John said, his voice cold. But I will make sure the truth gets out. With the cargo hold locked and the documents secured, John made his decision. He wasn't going to let the lies win. The plane's descent began as he made his way back to his seat. He wasn't just carrying a soldier's body anymore. He was carrying the truth, and this time, no one would be able to bury it.